Sometimes game developers will have a game or two in their entire catalogue that don't appear to fit into anything that they've made outside of their usual stuff. This can be a good or a bad thing depending on the kind of game it is, really. For example, Criterion Games and Codemasters are both examples of development studios which both, relatively recently at least, make racing games, but also dabbled in making a first-person shooter, the former making Black, and the latter making Body Count. Black was generally well received and reviewed quite well, but in Codemasters' case, whilst F1 2010, which released 1 year previous, had seen a solid amount of positive reception, Body Count's middling, unremarkable reception resulted in Codemasters' Guildford closing. It's the sort of thing that can make or break a studio, and it's especially difficult to do when you're a studio that has done relatively little else compared to what you might be used to seeing from them. It's the sort of thing that you'd expect from a studio more in its first flush, like Criterion, who had only started its famous Burnout series just a few years previous, despite being a full-on studio in 1996. I'm older than Criterion is. That is scary. Anyhow, now that I've explained that it's difficult for a studio to make something outside of its wheelhouse, let's talk about a game that happens to have been made by a group of developers better known for making one of the most famous and well-regarded racing franchises ever. Let's talk about a little outlier of a game called Omega Boost. Omega Boost is a mecha action shoot-'em-up released in 1999 and developed by Polyphony Digital for the PlayStation. Polyphony Digital, who saw tremendous success in 1997 following the release of Gran Turismo, decided their next game needed a wild change in style. The origins of this game's development come largely from, of all places, one of Sega's new franchises for the Saturn, 1995's Panzer Dragoon, developed by Sega AM6, also known as Team Andromeda. In Panzer Dragoon, you play as a dragoon who pilots a dragon, obviously, whilst all manner of enemies come at you from all directions, requiring you to deal with them with the abilities at your disposal. The game released as a launch title for the Saturn and was generally well received at the time as an example of what the Saturn could conceivably do, but the odd reviewer saw it as a little more than a Space Harrier replacement. Over the years, Panzer Dragoon would get several different games, including a remake of the original on newer systems, but after a few titles, owing to the difficult lack of success outside of Japan for the Saturn, Sega restructured some of their studios. This resulted in some of Team Andromeda splintering off to different studios, and one such developer within that team was Yuji Yasuhara, a programmer on the sequel to Panzer Dragoon, titled Panzer Dragoon 2 Zwei. Following this, he would be taken in at Polyphony Digital, where he would eventually work on the user interface for the PlayStation 2 Gran Turismo games, and eventually as an engineer for the PlayStation 3 games. Before all that, however, he would take up the mantle as the designer and lead programmer for what would be simply phrased as Panzer Dragoon, but with mechs. If you ask me, that sounds like a winning combination. It's even more of a winning combination when you get legendary mecha designer Shoji Kawamori, the man behind Macross, as well as the mecha designs for Armored Core, the Vision of Escaflowne, and Eureka 7 on board to design your mechs. Combine it with some glorious 90s full motion video sequences, and you've got yourself a game for the ages in my opinion. So now that we've basically discussed how this game came about, let's talk about what the game comes in, the packaging. First off, let's compare this dark, almost minimalist cover with the covers those in the West would get. The main difference is how the mech is striking some sort of threatening pose and emerging from an explosion in the Western box arts, compared to the sinister yet braced appearance of the mech in the Japanese cover. The other notable difference is how the American box art uses some weird Art Deco font, compared to the European and Japanese box arts, which use a more stylish font with some editing done to it. There is also some very small print between the Omega and Boost in the logo, and it's very awkward to say the least. I'll leave it up for a few seconds more so you can read it to try and understand it. I mean, it's ostensibly English, so let's switch around to the back real quick, and we get ourselves a healthy dose of images and not all that much text. Very much operating by the principle of show don't tell. I like it. Inside we get a fairly hefty instruction manual as well as the CD. The manual, being quite thick, has a lot of information inside it which, if you don't understand Japanese, will not be massively useful, but if you know what to pick out, it can certainly come in handy. There is also a surprising amount of English text which can alleviate some of the issues in trying to understand what's useful in this manual. Ultimately, it might prove useful if you want a better understanding of the game, but if even katakana is beyond you, your faith is being put squarely on the feet of the in-game tutorials. And speaking of, I think it best that we go into starting up the game, so let's get cracking. True to form for the PlayStation, this game starts up with a full motion video sequence to introduce you to this game's story. Yeah, surprisingly enough, Polyphony Digital actually went out of their way to make a story for this game. To give you a brief synopsis of this game's story, sometime into the future, AlphaCore, a sentient AI construct capable of tremendous power, waged war against humanity after it discovered AlphaCore's true capability and tried to dump it. Because of this, a group of scientists, engineers, commanders and a plucky pilot worked together with the use of a bipedal machine called the Omega Boost in a mission to go back in time to 1946, find ENIAC and replace an infected vacuum tube to prevent AlphaCore from becoming an all-domineering monster. With this, we get a sequence of the Omega Boost showing off some of its abilities and wrecking a bunch of enemy machines, among many other things. It's essentially an FMV sequence of the game's story. Speaking of the story, I'm not actually going to bother putting up a spoiler warning for this game. Whilst this game does have a story, it's not exactly like it matters much. Do people care about being spoiled for games like The House of the Dead and Time Crisis? In other words, don't worry about being spoiled on the story, as it won't have a perceivable effect on your enjoyment of the game. This game is all about the gameplay and the 9-level campaign mode within. So strap yourself in! We go into the main menu to be greeted by a lot of orange and a lot of shade by Feeder. There is a training mode which allows you to acclimate to the controls, but I think it's best if we go to the campaign. So let's go. We get a cinematic explaining the mission plan to us. Apparently it is the year 2099 and we're hovering around the planet Eta. Our goal is to make Planetfall onto Eta and use its Timeshaft to go back to 1946. With that, we are given control, and now I will take the time to very carefully go over the controls because this game plays in a very weird fashion. The D-pad or left analog stick control your movement, you can change your camera view with the select button, the square and X buttons fire your Vulcan cannon or homing lasers, and the triangle and circle allow you to perform a boost, enabling you to dodge enemy attacks. I should add that by default, up and down on the D-pad and analog stick are made to move the opposite way, so if you press up, you'll move Omega Boost down and vice versa. You can set it so that it is no longer inverted however in the options menu. On the face of it, the controls don't seem that weird, they seem simple in fact, but that's only the half of it all, as the place where all the chaos happens is the shoulder buttons, especially L1 and R1. The most important one of these buttons is L1, which enables scan mode. With scan mode you can move Omega Boost to orbit around an object with the help of the movement controls, or you can use it to lock on quickly to nearby enemies as opposed to manually moving the camera. This button is especially important when it comes to boss encounters later on, so be sure to burn that into your mind. After all, player must understand the meanings of what is seen on screen and how to maneuver Omega Boost, as the manual makes abundantly clear. Other buttons on here include the R2 button, which enables you to look behind you. Not entirely sure why that would be useful, especially if the L1 button exists in this context, but I suppose, much like the select button changing camera positions, it's a carryover from Gran Turismo. The other button we're talking about for now is R1, which has its own setting in the options menu. Depending on the setting, this button either stops the Omega Boost or moves it forward. This button is a pretty important one to understand, as controlling Omega Boost is chaotic enough at the best of times. I personally set this to move Omega Boost and have Omega Boost be naturally stationary unless I command it to move. Coming from games like Zone of the Enders, whose control scheme is one of the most fluid I've ever used, this plays entirely differently. It's surreal when you actually start out, but as with many things, once you start playing with it, it becomes much less bizarre and you do get used to it. How long it takes for you to acclimate to it depends on you, generally speaking, but on the whole it's a very unusual control style that could have perhaps been made simpler, but this isn't exactly the most conventional game out there. So now that I've nattered on about the controls, how about I talk about the game's structure? With that in mind, let's go over how this game is structured and the way the campaign plays out. To start off, it's very short. The game only consists of 9 levels throughout the game, which takes an hour to beat. So this game is not massive in content, but I'm of the view that looking at a game's length and judging its quality or value on that alone is myopic and doesn't betray the game's true value. With that in mind, if you're playing this game, be aware that while you can beat this game in an hour, it isn't immediately going to happen, and it can take a few hours to actually beat the game after adjusting to the controls, working out optimal strategies against bosses and so on. As for how each level is structured, it consists quite simply of a wave of a bunch of enemies, before a mini-boss arrives to require your attention, and once the mini-boss is down, the actual boss arrives to want to ruin your day. It's a fairly simple traditional structure that you see in arcade shooters such as the 2 that I mentioned already. You deal with a whole bunch of enemies, then you have a boss encounter which requires you to strategize and plan your attacks. It's not unique by any stretch, but it's definitely consistent, and most levels work in this manner, requiring you to deal with waves of enemies, followed by a mini-boss encounter that serves as the hors d'oeuvre for what's about to come in the proper boss encounter. At the end of each level, you will be ranked on your performance based on how long it took you to beat the level and how many enemies you defeated along the way. You are given a pilot rank ranging D at the worst to S at the highest, and if your rank is B or better, you will level Omega Boost up, increasing how many homing lasers it can fire at any time. You also get some of your health back, although I don't know how much health you get back, or what metrics it's based on. I think you tend to get back a set percentage of your max health, with an additional percentage based on your lost health. I don't know, it's a bit weird. I could perhaps talk about some of the things that happen in this game, primarily the enemies you encounter. There is one slight issue with this, however. Everything may as well be the same. Each enemy has its own appearances, some take more than one shot to kill, and there is definitely some level of strategy to defeating some of them, but on the whole, regular enemies don't take a lot. That being said, this is only really the case for the earlier levels, as later levels start to use more complex enemies that require more shots to kill and require tactical manoeuvring to avoid damage. The boss encounters, to which I refer to both mid-bosses and standard bosses, are all challenges in and of themselves, each with a veritable arsenal that engages you, ranging from stuff like a massive super fortress, to a Shah Aznable facsimile, to something that looks like it was lifted right out of Warhammer 40k. Each of these encounters has something memorable about it, and even though you get the occasional moment of frustration when a boss does something absurd, usually it's the fault of the player for making that kind of mistake. And whilst many of the bosses can simply be beaten by shooting at them, there are instances where shooting them in certain places can help you, as it can limit their offensive capability and allow you to take more risks. So to summarise what's happened so far in this game, I've defeated a roboticized space rock with large balls orbiting it, something that looks like a combined landmine from Half-Life 2, a tanker ship, and someone who wants to be a rival, all before making Planetfall onto Eta. Following that and entering Eta's atmosphere, I've also taken down a robot that follows the religion of the Etano Circus, and half of a flying pizza with guns on it. Having surfaced onto a most hostile environment, I was then accosted by a quadruped that seems very content to get rather handsy, as well as a large burrowing worm and a very heavily modified squat colossus. And now, we make our way into a Timeshaft. The Timeshaft can simply be described as an extraordinarily complex and long tunnel that works as a time machine, but also as a means to get utterly mobbed by enemies due to how difficult it can be to manoeuvre in this place. You need to have your wits about you in this place at all times, as enemies will be attached to the walls, come from behind you, and even fill up the tunnel, such as this weird gate thing. This six-legged thing at the end, however, is a massive nuisance, and I almost always end up near death's door fighting this thing. Which reminds me, you get 5 continues in this game. Polyphony Digital realised how difficult this game can be, and so chucked in a healthy supply of continues to get you at least half a chance at beating a given boss. Another good thing is if you die on the same level a second time, upon continuing you get a complete health restoration, which gives you even more of a chance to take revenge on the thing that took you down, something that will come in very useful later on. The only downside, however, is that your score gets reset upon the use of a continue. Your high score of the session counts at the end, but dying late on and continuing can decide your high score there and then. Perhaps I should talk about the visuals now. This game has the distinction of being one of the few PlayStation games that can actually play in 60 frames per second, which, if you're an action game nut, that's a pretty useful thing. I should add though that this is something that it achieves only some of the time, so don't expect many moments where you're playing this game at the maximum 60 FPS. Despite that, you get a game that plays very smoothly and at a frame rate that most other PlayStation games, especially 3D ones, could not achieve because the hardware wasn't as good as it could be for that purpose. If this shows you anything, it should show you how good Polyphony Digital can be when it comes to graphics, because they managed to do some incredible stuff with this game, just as they pulled off some incredible visuals for the Gran Turismo games they're better known for. As for the art style, I am actually kind of impressed by it. There's a weird organic appearance to some of the enemies in the game that I can't really describe all that well, especially compared to the mechanical designs that make up much of the roster of the enemies in this game. When it comes to the game's enemy design, there's a decent amount of variety, even if many of the usual enemies go down as if they're made of paper. And the boss designs are all pretty neat in general, and have some pretty cool details to them in places. And as I alluded to earlier, you can break apart some of the zone bosses to neutralise their offensive capabilities, and take them down easier, and you can see it have a genuine effect on the appearance of the boss, which is cool. Now that I've mentioned the visual component of this audio-visual medium, let's talk about the audio side of things, and I'll start off with the sound effects, which sound especially heavy, although I can't help but think I've heard the laser cannon sound before. The only gripe I have with the sound effects mainly come from when some enemies perform an attack and it's so incredibly loud. It didn't need to be this loud, but for whatever reason they made it so. It's like listening to a fairly quiet, gentle playlist, only for the next track to be by Midori. Oh, and speaking of music, as for the soundtrack, there are a few things about this game's soundtrack. The soundtrack was done primarily by Jun Kitagawa, better known by the pseudonym CMJK. A DJ with a penchant for electronic pop music, his work has a distinct sound to it, one of his more notable works being that of the song Information High from the soundtrack to Macross Plus. I wonder if he was recommended by Shoji Kawamori because of that. This game's soundtrack tends to get drowned out a little bit by the chaos that unfolds behind it, but on the whole, the soundtrack provides something of a nice backdrop, although there are times where lyrics can appear which sound fairly inappropriate considering the situation. It doesn't get excessively busy, but it's not so simple that it becomes forgettable, especially when you sit down and listen to it, where the only downside to that is that it sounds a little bit muffled sometimes. There is also the matter of the licensed music in the game. Each version has its own opening music which plays over the opening FMV sequence, with the Japanese version in particular featuring Shade by Feeder. Anyone familiar with Gran Turismo doubtless knows who Feeder are, and this is no bad thing because they make some pretty good music. To be truthful, I'm actually struggling to think of all that much more to talk about with this game. Not because I think it's bad, quite the contrary, but I'm just struggling to think of anything that's especially noteworthy about this game. Because of that, I'm going to hurry along now and talk about how, following the Timeshaft kerfuffle, we end up from 2099 to the far-flung past of 2097. Better get back to Earth soon so I can see Faisal Oricom in the F5000 Anti-Gravity Racing League. After going backwards both in time and in progress, we find ourselves accosted by a large alien bone that can shoot lasers, flanked by smaller ships that take considerably less piss to deal with, followed by a large space dragon that requires being shot on the body to whittle down. We make Planetfall on Ether a second time, where we deal with a lot of mechs, like a lot of large bipedal mechs, as well as a bizarre motorcycle-like robot that just really wants to run around like it owns the place. Destroying it is only half the battle, as the wheels turn out to be Transformers, robots in disguise, and they T-pose as well. Damn it, Kawamori. Beta Boost, the rival for the sake of having a rival, returns and is even more powerful than before, complete with incredible amounts of ridiculousness where its arsenal is concerned. Hell, it even has the Viper Boost attack that you have. Wait, that's something I could talk about. Viper Boost! Okay, so as you play the game after beating Beta Boost for the first time, you unlock an attack for the Omega Boost known as Viper Boost. That is quite a lot of boost in one sentence, so... Essentially, you fill up a bar above your health bar, and when it gets to about a quarter full, you can press L2 to activate a powerful attack called the Viper Boost, which allows you to annihilate enemies with ease, and the bigger the bar, the longer it lasts. Save it for the tricky bosses though. Also, don't rely on this to do all the work, you still got to whittle down the boss's health. Still, it does make it a touch easier to deal with. Because of that, the game's final player ranking adds the prefix Pixie if you use it at any point, which, sure, whatever. After surviving the battle against Beta Boost, we find ourselves going subterranean again and into the planet to encounter AlphaCore itself, which looks like something I would expect to see in a Sonic the Hedgehog game as far as boss design goes. Taking special care to obliterate the cone-shaped thing on its back when it decides to explode for a second, we deal with it within the not quite 2-minute time limit before the ground collapses and we are forced to fight what looks like sentient Gak. In this phase, AlphaCore doesn't appear to be all that offensive. If anything, it just takes the damage you deal, but you have to deal it fairly quickly, as you only have 1 minute before the planet explodes, exposing another Timeshaft in doing so, and we go in it. In this section, we fight 3 different phases of AlphaCore. Firstly, as the core as it appears in its crystalline form. Take care not to shoot it with the homing lasers, instead using the regular shots to damage it, but also take care to not fire at it whilst it has turret-like orbs circling it. After that phase, it takes the form of a dragon similar to the 2 that we fought already, only a lot more dangerous as the claustrophobic Timeshaft struggles to accommodate both you and the dragon form of AlphaCore. That is, until you destroy it in battle. But AlphaCore itself continues further into the Timeshaft before you enter the warp zone along with it, to do battle against it one final time. Taking on the form of an angelic figure, it's obscenely easy by comparison to what came before it, as you generally only have to avoid the projectiles it fires out. The only hard thing about this battle is how it tries to go for a pot shot at the end by repeating the same trick as a previous mini-boss. Despite this, however, the environment, the graphical effects and the general tone of it all makes this fairly memorable as far as battles go. Also, using shade again is pretty cool, although I'm not entirely sure why the developers opted for this. Once we defeat the AlphaCore, it tries to consume us, but it instead destroys itself. Following this, we see a couple driving in an open-top car along a road to Philadelphia. Moments later, the sky suddenly turns stormy, before it suddenly vomits something out. That thing is the Omega Boost, which crashes into some Appalachian forest, before a probe is fired from the Omega Boost to find its way to the University of Pennsylvania, home of ENIAC, to replace the AlphaCore infected vacuum tube with a new, clean one. And credits. This game is not easy, nor really should it be. It's not very long, being basically just 1 hour long, or even half an hour if you decide to be a mad lad and blaze your way through after practicing it enough. It does try to eke out some replayability with its zone play mode, but all in all, if you've beaten the game, unless you really want to speedrun it, there isn't really much of a reason to return to it afterwards. It's a pretty solid game. For some people, it's one of their favourites, and in a way I can agree with that. But in writing and filming this review, I kept wondering to myself if I thought this game was a good game, or a great game. I like the music, and I like the visuals, and I like the ideas behind it, but the gameplay is somewhat awkward to me. Although it is relatively early as far as mecha action games are concerned, so it didn't really set a standard, or even really have one to work with, and the controls take a fair bit of getting used to, which you do after a while. Also, when I said I was struggling to think of anything to talk about with this game, I wasn't kidding. This game somehow has less meat on its bones than Panel de Pon. Because whilst all you pretty much do in Panel de Pon is swap tiles left and right, the game affords a lot of different gameplay modes to switch things up. I realise trying to make a comparison between Panel de Pon and Omega Boost is rather silly, but at the end of the day, one was released as a cheaper title for an outgoing system, whilst the other was sold at retail price for a system that was the hottest thing since the core of the sun. Ultimately, Omega Boost is a pretty weird game to me. It's good, but I struggle to think of many things that are particularly remarkable about it, apart from maybe the graphics and its 60 FPS capabilities. Still, some people love it, so fair enough. As far as importability and language requirements are concerned, with the former it's kind of weird. Yahoo Auctions has several listings of the game at 500 yen, with Amazon Japan having used copies of the game for anywhere between 300 and 2,000 yen. By comparison, eBay UK listings have the game priced in the region of £30 to £40, which is quite a lot frankly. eBay US listings are for copies of the game in all manners of conditions, ranging from not having a case, to not having a manual, to just being the disc in a paper sleeve for $15. I'm not sure what to make of this weird disparity in prices. I suppose this could suggest that the game is probably more popular in Japan, because mechs are something of a hotness there, but there doesn't seem to be much in the way of consistency with pricing. As for language requirements, you don't really need any Japanese to understand the game. All spoken dialogue, much of the menu and the level completion screens are all in English, so navigating your way is relatively straightforward. In some parts it can help you understand what you're supposed to do in the tutorials, as an example, but in general it's not essential to play or even really beat the game. If you want a Japanese copy of the game, go right ahead and buy it. Now let's talk about what came out of this game. Or at least I would if there was anything that came out of this game. This game doesn't even have a sequel, a reboot, a remake, a remaster, not even a re-release on the PlayStation 1 Classic. It barely even has merchandise, just a couple figures. Omega Boost stands out as an outlier in the catalogue for Polyphony Digital, who went on to specialise in developing the Gran Turismo games into the behemoth that they are today. And due to the poor marketing and limited exposure for Omega Boost, it didn't sell well at all. It's kind of a shame really. Whilst I'm not entirely in love with this game, I do think that there is something here that could be worth revisiting if Sony was interested in doing so. Hell, a remake for the upcoming PlayStation 5 could be an option if they get Japan Studio to work on it. And whilst Omega Boost didn't really live on, it can be argued as having influenced other mecha action games like Zone of the Enders and more recent games such as Strike Vector and Daemon X Machina. So whilst I don't care a tremendous amount for this game, it's not necessarily something that deserves to be lost to time. All because at the end of the day, Omega Boosters have something about it. So who knows, it might be your thing. So if you can find it cheap enough, give it a go. That about wraps it up for Omega Boost. I'm not really sure what to make of it, to be honest. But for someone watching this, I'm sure it'll be worth giving a shot. Thank goodness I don't give scores in my reviews. Ugh. And with that, that's pretty much it. In the next episode, we are going to celebrate the 25th anniversary of a game series that I have wanted to talk about for quite some time. They're not Japanese, but it doesn't matter. If you have any ideas of what I ought to cover in the future, please let me know in the comments. And my VG Collect list and Twitter link are in the description down below, if you want to keep track on what I own and if you want to keep updated on what I do. As ever though, this has been Daniel Learmouth. Sadi.